When life gives us moments to help someone, we often don't realize that the smallest act can return to us in ways we never imagined. This story begins in a quiet neighborhood where an elderly woman named Grace lived alone in a small but cozy house. Her life had been simple, filled with memories, routines, and a few treasured belongings that reminded her of loved ones she had lost over the years. Among these precious items was an old wool blanket, a blanket her late mother had sewn by hand, piece by piece, when Grace was still a child. The blanket was faded now, its colors softened by time, but it carried warmth far beyond fabric. It held the scent of home, the feeling of safety, and the love of a mother who had always been her source of strength. Grace kept it folded neatly at the foot of her bed, touching it every night before she slept, as if her mother's hand still rested on her shoulder. One winter morning, a harsh cold swept through the town. The kind of cold that makes even strong people shiver. Grace stepped outside to check her mailbox, and that's when she noticed a young man sitting near the sidewalk. He was wrapped in nothing but a thin jacket, trembling as he held his knees close to his chest. His eyes were sunken, and his lips were turning pale from the icy air. He looked up nervously when he heard her footsteps, preparing himself for rejection, the kind that people without homes know too well. But Grace didn't look at him with judgment. She saw only a human who was cold, hungry, and frightened. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked softly. The young man hesitated, unsure whether to tell the truth. "I'm fine, just resting," he whispered, though his shivers told a different story. Grace looked at him for a moment and felt a deep ache in her heart. She had seen people struggle before, but something about him reminded her of her own son, who had moved away years ago. She always worried about him, whether he ate enough, whether he slept well, whether he had someone who would care for him if he ever needed help. Without another thought, Grace turned and walked back into her house. She went straight to her room, opened the chest at the foot of her bed, and pulled out the old blanket. Her fingers lingered on it, feeling the familiar softness of the fabric. She closed her eyes for a moment, almost hearing her mother's voice telling her, "Warm someone's heart when you can." With those words echoing inside her, Grace stepped outside again and walked toward the young man. "Here," she said gently, placing the folded blanket in his arms. He stared at it, then at her. "Ma'am, I can't take this," he said, his voice trembling. "Yes, you can," she insisted with a warm smile. "It's meant for someone who needs it." The young man unfolded the blanket and wrapped it tightly around himself. The look of relief that washed over his face was something Grace never forgot. His frozen hands stopped shaking, his shoulders loosened, and for the first time that morning, he breathed deeply. "Thank you," he whispered, his eyes glistening with tears. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to," she said softly. "Just stay warm." He nodded and repeated the words like a promise. That day, Grace returned to her home with a strange mix of sadness and peace. She knew she had given away something deeply precious, but she also felt her mother would have approved. She made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the young man walk away with her blanket wrapped around him like an embrace. Days passed, then weeks, and life returned to its quiet rhythm. Yet something inside Grace felt emptier without the blanket. She missed the comfort it gave her at night. She missed the memories stitched into its fabric. But she comforted herself with the thought that it was helping someone survive the cold. Winter eventually softened into spring. Flowers bloomed, birds returned, and the world felt lighter. But Grace didn't feel the same. She had begun to feel unusually tired, more than just age, something deeper. She brushed it off as exhaustion until she collapsed one afternoon in her garden. A neighbor found her and called an ambulance. Grace was taken to the hospital, where doctors told her she had a heart condition that needed urgent treatment. She lived alone. No one knew her medical history. No one was there to speak for her. As she lay in the hospital bed, she felt the heavy weight of loneliness. One night, as machines beeped around her, Grace whispered to herself, "I wish someone would come." A single tear slipped down her cheek. But fate had already heard her earlier act of kindness, and the miracle was on its way. The next morning, a young man walked into the hospital lobby, asking the nurse for a patient named Grace Whitfield. He was clean now, healthier, dressed properly. The nurse looked surprised but guided him to Grace's room. When he stepped inside, Grace opened her eyes slowly, and her breath caught. The same young man she had helped months ago stood before her, his eyes filled with recognition and gratitude. "Do you remember me?" he asked softly. Grace nodded weakly, her voice faint. "You're the boy, with the blanket." He pulled out the same blanket from a bag he carried. It had been washed, stitched, repaired, and folded with extraordinary care. He placed it gently on her lap. "This kept me alive," he said. "I got a job at a construction site because I wasn't freezing on the streets anymore. I found a shelter. I turned my life around. And I promised myself that if I ever found you, I would return the warmth you gave me." Grace touched the blanket with trembling hands. It felt just as it had before, soft, warm, comforting. But now it held a new meaning. The young man continued, "I heard from your neighbor that you were brought here. I'll be here for you. You're not alone." Over the next several days, he stayed by her side. He helped the nurses, brought her flowers, read to her, and talked to her every evening. He told her about the job he got, the small room he rented, and how her kindness gave him the strength to rebuild his life. Grace felt as if life had given her a son again, someone who cared, someone who stayed. One evening, she asked him quietly, "Why are you doing all this for me?" He smiled, the same grateful smile she remembered from the sidewalk. "Because you wrapped me in warmth when the world had turned its back on me. And because miracles should be returned to where they began." Grace recovered slowly, but surely. And when she was discharged, the young man walked beside her, carrying her things, including the precious blanket. He drove her home, not to an empty house, but to a place that now felt alive again. He visited her every week. Sometimes with groceries, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to fix things around the house. Their bond grew deeper, turning strangers into family. And every time Grace touched the blanket, she remembered the moment she gave it away, and how it returned to her not just as fabric, but as a living miracle. Kindness, she realized, never disappears. It travels, it grows, and it finds its way back to us in ways more beautiful than we can imagine. And sometimes, all it takes is an old blanket to change two lives forever.